When the racist old woman gave gifts to every child except the black girl, the heart of Willow Creek cracked in silence. Big Shaq didn't look away. Big Shaq stood tall, and with one bold move, Big Shaq made the whole town see the truth they tried to ignore. What began as a cruel slight turned into a revolution no one could stop. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, and one Big Shaq to change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Willow Creek had a way of dressing up for summer like it knew it was on display. The morning sun soaked the town square in a honey-colored glow, casting long golden fingers across the brick sidewalks. Wind chimes sang in lazy harmony from front porches, where rocking chairs moved just slightly with the breeze. Kids rode their bikes in looping figure eights near the old willow trees that gave the town its name. On the surface, Willow Creek was every bit the portrait of small-town America. Picturesque, proud, peaceful. But beneath the charming facade, something unspoken simmered, an old tension that never fully died out. You could feel it in the stiff smiles exchanged between certain neighbors, the way some shopkeepers locked their doors just a little earlier than others, the cautious glances passed across park benches. It wasn't the kind of thing a tourist would notice. It was quieter than that, subtler. But for someone who knew how to listen, someone like Big Shaq, it was loud as a drum. Big Shaq, or simply Shaq as everyone called him, was impossible to miss. At 7 feet 1, with a frame built like a fortress, but a heart as soft as fresh bread, Shaq had become a cornerstone of Willow Creek, not because of his money, although everyone knew he had more than the whole town combined, but because he chose to stay rooted here. He had traveled the world, stood under bigger lights, signed autographs for kings and presidents, and yet somehow every time he came back to Willow Creek, he looked around with that same boyish grin, as if there was no place he'd rather be. Shaq wasn't just a local celebrity, he was family to them. He helped rebuild the youth center after the flood, paid off hospital bills for strangers, and sponsored the town's Little League team even though he had no children playing. Shaq didn't just live in Willow Creek, he loved it. This morning, Shaq was at the town bakery, balancing a box of glazed donuts with one hand, while signing a little boy's cast with the other. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly woman who ran the bakery, beamed at him from behind the counter. "You're an angel, Shaquille," she said, sliding a few extra donuts into the box. "Don't tell Father Mark," she winked. Shaq chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Your secret's safe with me, Mrs. D," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. He stepped outside into the growing warmth of the day, savoring the sweetness of the air and the feel of home on his skin. From across the square he saw little Janelle running through the fountain, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Janelle was 7, full of fire and sunshine, and one of the few black children in the whole town. Her mother, Tasha, worked 2 jobs and still found time to bake pies for every charity event the town threw. Shaq watched them both with a tender smile, a knot of protectiveness curling in his chest. He knew what it was like to stand out in a crowd that wasn't made for you, knew what it was to be loved, but always with a caveat. The town was gearing up for the Founders' Day parade, a decades-old tradition where every family lined the streets waving tiny flags and throwing candy to kids. There would be floats made of crepe paper and pickup trucks decorated with handmade signs. At the center of it all was Miss Clarabel Dawson, the so-called Queen of Willow Creek. She had lived in the biggest house at the top of Birch Hill for longer than most could remember. White gloves, pearls, a gaze as sharp as broken glass. That was Clarabel. She ran the Founders' Day committee like a general commanding her troops, and every year she made a grand show of gifting toys to the town's children during the parade. It was the highlight for most kids, and every year it was the same. Beaming smiles, clapping parents, a ribbon-tied mountain of toys. But Shaq remembered last year too well. He remembered how Clarabel's hand had paused, just briefly, when Janelle had stepped forward with her bright, eager smile. The moment had passed quickly, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Shaq had been looking, and what he saw lodged a splinter deep in his heart. He had seen the slight tightening of Clarabel's lips, the way she skipped over Janelle without missing a beat. The other kids hadn't noticed, neither had most of the parents. But Shaq did. He never forgot the look on Janelle's face. Confused, a little hurt, but trying to be brave. He hadn't said anything then. Had convinced himself it was an accident. Had told himself that maybe Clarabel just hadn't seen her. But a part of him knew better. And now, as the sun blazed above Willow Creek, As the preparations for this year's parade swung into full motion, that splinter began to ache deeply. Walking toward the hardware store, Shaq passed clusters of volunteers busy painting banners and stringing lights. He stopped to help Tommy Jenkins hang a sign that was slipping from its nails. "Thanks, Shaq," Tommy panted, dusting his hands off. "Town wouldn't be the same without you." Shaq only smiled, brushing the compliment aside. It wasn't about being thanked. It was about doing right by the people who needed you most, even when they didn't know it yet. In the alley behind the general store, Shaq overheard a conversation that made him pause. Mrs. Clarabel Dawson's voice, brittle and cutting, floated over. "We keep traditions alive by knowing our place, Harold," she said sharply. "This isn't about hurting feelings. It's about preserving dignity, standards. Willow Creek has standards." Harold mumbled something in response, something too low for Shaq to catch, but the damage was already done. Shaq stood frozen, the donut box heavy in his hands. He knew then that last year hadn't been an accident. It was a choice, a deliberate, cold-blooded choice. The realization settled over Shaq like a storm cloud. His mind flashed to Janelle's smile, to Tasha's weary hopefulness, to every kindness he had seen in this town, and every cruelty it had hidden. The old Willow Creek that he loved wasn't innocent after all. It had cracks in its foundation, cracks that people like Clarabel Dawson worked hard to paper over with parades and pastries. Shaq walked back to his truck, the world suddenly quieter, the sunlight harsher. He placed the donut box carefully on the passenger seat, his heart thudding slow and heavy. His first instinct was rage, a roaring flame that demanded justice, demanded action. But Shaq had learned long ago that the loudest fight wasn't always the strongest. Sometimes change came in whispers. Sometimes it came in gestures so big they couldn't be ignored. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing with crystal clarity. He would not let another Founder's Day pass with that same splinter sinking deeper into someone else's heart. Not if he could help it. The town was smiling now, busy with ribbons and laughter. But Willow Creek didn't know what was coming. It didn't know that this year's parade would not end the way it always had. Not with safe applause and polite speeches. No. Big Shaq was going to turn the whole day upside down, and when he was done, no one would ever look at Willow Creek the same way again. As Shaq drove away, the bell from St. Luke's Church rang noon over the rooftops, sharp and clear against the deep blue sky. The sound echoed through the streets like a warning, a promise, and a heartbeat all at once. Something was about to change, and it was going to start with him. In Willow Creek, the annual Founder's Day Parade wasn't just an event, it was the heartbeat of the town. Generations had gathered under the same sun, lined the same cobbled streets, and cheered as the floats rolled by, with crepe paper streamers fluttering like confetti in the wind. Children buzzed with excitement, their faces painted, hands sticky from lemonade and cotton candy. The town square, dressed in red, white, and blue, shimmered under the sharp midday light. Every store had a hand-painted banner in the window, every porch draped with a flag. The scent of popcorn, freshly cut grass, and engine oil from the vintage tractors filled the air, stirring memories that clung to the skin like the summer heat. Big Shaq stood by the Veterans Memorial, towering over the crowd but blending into it with the ease of a man who had learned long ago how to wear his size like a soft cloak, not a shield. He wore simple jeans and a faded Willow Creek Wildcats t-shirt, a nod to the local high school team he had sponsored for years. Children raced past him, giggling, oblivious to the giant in their midst. Parents waved, some shy, some bold, all grateful. Shaq returned every gesture with a nod or a grin, his heart swelling with the complicated love he carried for this place. It wasn't perfect. It had bruises, but it was his home. The first notes of the high school marching band floated through the square, a slightly off-key but endearing rendition of America the Beautiful. Mothers adjusted wide-brimmed hats. Fathers slapped each other's backs and swapped exaggerated stories of parades past. Shaq watched it all with a tenderness that was only slightly marred by the sharp edge of memory. Last year, the small hurt he had witnessed but done nothing about. Not this time, he thought. Not again. From the corner of his eye, he spotted her. Mrs. Clarabel Dawson, perched atop the lead parade float like royalty surveying her kingdom. Her float was a masterpiece of tradition. White doves crafted from paper mache, a giant golden WC for Willow Creek, and garlands of silk flowers trailing behind the truck like a wedding veil. Clarabel herself was dressed impeccably, as always in a tailored lilac dress with matching gloves and a hat tilted at the perfect angle. In her gloved hands she held a large wicker basket wrapped in lace. A gift basket, a parade tradition as old as the town itself. Children would line up after the final float rolled by, and Clarabel would hand out small but thoughtful presents: jump ropes, baseball mitts, dollhouses, action figures. It was meant to symbolize community and kindness, the passing down of goodwill from one generation to the next. It was a cherished ritual, and Mrs. Clarabella Bazin had become synonymous with it. But Shaq saw past the lavender and lace. He saw the hard glint in her eyes, the tight smile that didn't quite reach the corners of her mouth. Willow Creek adored her, but it adored an idea of her, not the truth. The parade wound its way through the square with predictable charm. There was the 4-H club's float with real goats and chickens, the garden society tossing flower petals into the crowd, the volunteer fire department spraying mist from their antique engine, causing children to scream and dart for cover. Shaq clapped along with the others, but his attention was locked on the gift basket, his gut tightening with every step that brought Clarabel closer to the end of the road. At last the final float rolled by, and the crowd surged forward, gathering near the reviewing stand. Clarabel rose regally from her chair, smiling down at the sea of expectant faces. She called the children forward, and one by one they ascended the small wooden steps to receive their treasures. The crowd murmured approvingly, snapping pictures, clapping after each presentation. Little Johnny from the hardware store got a model airplane. Lucy from the bakery received a pink tea set. Bobby, whose father ran the gas station, cradled a shiny new football. The procession moved smoothly, flawlessly, like a machine fine-tuned over decades. And then Janelle stepped forward. Shaq felt it before he saw it, the tiny hitch in Clarabel's posture, the slight but unmistakable hesitation, as Janelle's small hands reached up, full of hope. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. Clarabel's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, and then she bypassed Janelle's hand altogether, reaching instead for the boy behind her, handing him a gleaming toy truck with a grand flourish. Janelle stood there, hand still outstretched, confusion knitting her brow as the line pushed past her. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft, confused, but no one said anything. No one moved. Parents looked away. Some adjusted sunglasses. Others busied themselves with their phones or bent low to whisper to their children. The message was clear: keep smiling, keep clapping, pretend you didn't see it. But Shaq saw it. His heart hammered in his chest, a slow, furious rhythm. He watched as Janelle's mother, Tasha, hurried forward, gathering her daughter into a hug that tried to shield, to erase, to deny. But some wounds you couldn't cover. Some cuts you felt in the very marrow of your bones. Shaq clenched his fists at his sides, the urge to storm the stage boiling in his blood. But he didn't move. Not yet. There was a bigger battle to fight, and he would fight it with more than just outrage. He would fight it with something stronger, something lasting. As the crowd dispersed, laughing too loudly, moving too quickly, Shaq stayed where he was, a silent sentinel amid the swirl of forced cheer. Clarabel caught his eye for just a second, long enough for him to see the flicker of something there. Was it guilt, fear, or just the cold certainty that nothing would change? Shaq didn't know, but he intended to find out. He turned away from the reviewing stand, his mind already working, already plotting. This was not going to be another year of swallowed pain and painted smiles. Not this time. Willow Creek loved its traditions, but it was about to find out what real tradition meant. Not exclusion, not humiliation. Real tradition meant justice, kindness, courage, and Big Shaq was ready to teach them. The sun hung heavy over Willow Creek, bathing the square in a golden haze, as the last of the parade's floats rumbled out of sight. A slow, excited shuffle began, as the children gathered near the judging platform, the air thick with anticipation. Clarabel Dawson stood tall, her gloved hands folded neatly over the lace-trimmed wicker basket. A thin smile played across her lips, calculated and pristine, as she called the children forward one by one, her voice syrupy sweet and carrying easily over the gathering crowd. From his place by the fountain, Shaq leaned against the cool stone, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrow with attention sharpened by memory. Little Billy Hart was first, bounding up the steps with a freckled grin that split his face in two. Clarabel handed him a gleaming harmonica, wrapped in blue ribbon. The crowd clapped. Then came Ellie Mae, in her yellow sundress, who left with a teddy bear almost bigger than she was. On and on it went, each child receiving their prize, each parent snapping hurried photos, each applause blending into a constant hum. Shaq's gaze, however, wasn't on the smiling faces or the colorful toys. His focus was on the slim, patient figure waiting quietly at the back of the line. Janelle clutching the hem of her dress, her wide brown eyes shining with expectation. Janelle was the only child in that crowd, whose skin glowed a different shade under the sun, and today it seemed to make all the difference. Shaq felt the moment shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first tremor before a storm. Clarabel's hands faltered ever so slightly as she reached into her basket. She pulled out a bright, shiny red cart, the kind every child dreamed of pulling around their backyard, hauling treasures and secrets in summertime adventures. It was the crown jewel of the basket, larger and grander than any gift she had handed out so far. Gasps of excitement flared through the children, and even the adults leaned forward. Shaq saw it happen in slow motion. Janelle, face alight with wonder, took a hesitant step forward, her small hand rising toward the cart. For a heartbeat, time froze. Clarabel's smile thinned to a razor's edge. Without a word, she shifted the cart away and extended it instead to a blonde-haired boy standing just to Janelle's left. The boy blinked in confusion but accepted the gift with a shy nod. Janelle's hand hung in the air, empty, unnoticed. The silence hit first, a deep, almost physical silence that seemed to vacuum the sound from the square. Conversations stuttered, applause faltered. Somewhere, a baby cried. The world narrowed into the gap between Janelle and Clarabel, a chasm that spoke louder than any words could have. Shaq felt his stomach twist into a hard knot, his heart hammering with disbelief, and something hotter, something harder that burned behind his ribs. Janelle, brave Janelle, let her hand fall slowly to her side. Her smile wavered but didn't quite collapse, stitched together by some deep instinctive dignity that a child her age should never have had to learn. Her mother, Tasha, surged forward through the crowd, her face a mask of strained calm. She knelt, pulling Janelle close, murmuring something soothing that Shaq couldn't hear over the roaring in his ears. Clarabel continued the ceremony, as if nothing had happened, plucking smaller toys from her basket and handing them out mechanically. The crowd, sensing the discomfort, stirred uneasily. A few parents exchanged glances, a few shifted their feet, but no one spoke. No one challenged. The parade must go on, after all. Tradition must be preserved. Shaq stood rooted to the spot, fists clenched so tight his knuckles ached. He could feel every ounce of the town's silent complicity pressing down around him like a second sky. It would be so easy to explode, to march up those steps, to tear the basket from Clarabel's hands, to shout the truth until the whole town had no choice but to hear it. But violence, even in words, would only feed the very poison he wanted to rip out at its roots. Instead, Shaq took a slow, shuddering breath, forcing the heat to settle into something colder, sharper. He could not erase what had just happened, but he could choose what came next. He could forge a memory stronger than cruelty, a moment that Janelle, and every child watching, would carry with them longer than the sting of this slight. As the last toy was handed out and Clarabel began her rehearsed closing remarks, Shaq turned and strode toward his truck, parked just behind the courthouse. He didn't need to hear another self-congratulatory speech about community and tradition. Not today. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he felt thrumming in the marrow of his bones. Across the square, Janelle clutched a small, forgotten candy bar, a pitiful consolation someone had hastily pressed into her hands. Her eyes found Shaq's across the crowd, and in that moment, something silent and profound passed between them. A promise. Shaq dipped his head once, solemn and sure. Janelle's shoulders squared slightly, the hurt in her gaze dimming, replaced by a flicker of hope. He would not let this be the memory that defined her childhood. Willow Creek had drawn its lines in the dust today, but Big Shaq was ready to erase them. He didn't know yet exactly how he would do it, only that he must. The parade would end, the banners would be taken down, the laughter would fade, and the town would pretend again. But something had shifted irreversibly beneath the skin of Willow Creek, and Big Shaq would be the hand that peeled back the lies to reveal it. Tomorrow would not be like today. And by the time Shaq was finished, even Clarabel Dawson would have to reckon with a truth she could no longer bury under lace and lies. The parade was over, but the echoes of it clung to the town square like a stubborn mist. Decorations fluttered half-heartedly from lamp posts, and discarded candy wrappers tumbled along the sidewalks, chased by the lazy afternoon breeze. Families lingered in small clusters, laughing too loudly, speaking too quickly, as if determined to drown out the uncomfortable memory everyone pretended not to see. The sun, once a cheerful companion, now hung lower and harsher, throwing longer shadows that cut across the square like scars. Big Shaq leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, watching the town move like a wounded animal, pretending it wasn't hurt. His gaze swept across the square, taking in the brittle smiles, the averted eyes, the quick handshakes, and nervous laughter. Every conversation seemed brittle, every gesture rehearsed. It wasn't hard to tell what they were doing. They were whispering behind their smiles, choosing silence over confrontation, comfort over justice. He caught snippets of hurried dialogue as people passed him by, pretending not to notice the towering figure who saw too much. Poor little thing, but what can you do? Clarabel didn't mean anything by it. Best not to stir the pot. It's just how things are. Each phrase was a pebble thrown into the pit of his stomach, building a weight that made it hard to breathe. These weren't strangers, not faceless enemies. These were people Shaq had known his whole life. Folks he had coached, supported, prayed with. They weren't bad people. He knew that, but sometimes good people became the most dangerous, when they chose comfort over truth. Sometimes a town could rot from the inside, not because of what was shouted in anger, but because of what was whispered in cowardice. A group of men huddled near the old barber shop, their heads bent together in conversation. Shaq recognized them. Jim Parsons, whose daughter Shaq had sponsored for college. Earl McDaniels, who sold him lumber at a discount every Christmas. Pete Wilson, whose pickup Shaq had pulled from the floodwaters years ago. Good men, kind men, or so he had always believed. Now they stood with their hands in their pockets, their mouths tight, pretending that nothing had happened that morning, pretending that one little girl's pain wasn't worth disturbing their fragile peace. Shaq's jaw tightened as he forced himself to stay still. Every instinct screamed at him to march over, to demand they look him in the eye and admit what they were doing. But he knew better. Anger would only fortify the walls they had already built around their hearts. It would let them dismiss him as emotional, aggressive, all the words they used to excuse their own guilt. No, if change was going to come, it had to be bigger than anger. It had to be undeniable. He shifted his weight and turned his gaze back to the fountain, where Janelle now sat, her legs dangling above the water, her small hands twisting a piece of candy wrapper into a tight knot. Tasha hovered nearby, speaking quietly to a few other mothers, her smile tight, her shoulders rigid. There were whispers among them too, but these were different, quieter, sadder. Mothers who understood injustice, who carried it silently because they were used to it. Mothers who knew that today wasn't new, it was just more visible. Shaq's heart ached for them, for every woman who had to teach her child to be gracious in the face of cruelty, to smile even when the world spit in their face and called it rain. He pushed off his truck and started walking, weaving through the square. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the town's history was sinking into his bones. He nodded politely at the people he passed, watching them stiffen, watching their eyes slide away. He wasn't angry at them, not really. He was disappointed, a feeling so much worse, so much heavier than rage. In front of the town hall, Mayor Ruth Simmons stood, her pearl necklace gleaming against her tan skin, her hand fluttering nervously as she spoke with Clarabel Dawson. Shaq caught just enough to understand. The mayor was apologizing. Apologizing to Clarabel. For what? For the uncomfortable silence that had followed her act of cruelty. For the few murmured criticisms that had dared to slip through the cracks. Clarabel, for her part, stood proud, her back straight, her chin lifted in defiance. She looked like a woman who believed herself wronged, not exposed. Shaq knew then that waiting for the town to right itself would be useless. No whispered apologies, no stiff embraces, no empty gestures would fix what had been broken today. Change would not come because Willow Creek wanted it. It would come because someone demanded it, showed them what it should look like, made it so stark and so beautiful that they could not look away. The plan that had begun forming in his mind earlier that day solidified into something sharp and shining. It would have to be public, undeniable, a spectacle of kindness and truth so powerful that even the deepest bigotry could not silence it. It would have to be bigger than anger, bigger than Shaq himself. He turned one last time to look at the town he loved, the town that had taught him to play basketball, to believe in neighbors, to trust in tradition. It was still the town he loved, but love didn't mean letting the things you cherished rot. Love meant fighting for them, even when they fought back. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the square in deep shades of orange and red. Shaq walked away from the whispers and the smiles, his mind a furnace of purpose. Tomorrow he would show Willow Creek what it really meant to be a community. Tomorrow he would make them remember that kindness wasn't just a word you printed on banners and parade floats. It was a choice. And he was done letting them choose wrong. The evening air wrapped itself around Willow Creek like a heavy blanket. Thick and unyielding. Shaq sat alone on the weathered steps of the community center, elbows resting on his knees, gaze locked on the horizon where the last streaks of sun bled into the darkening sky. Around him, the world carried on in muted routine, storefronts dimming their lights, distant laughter spilling from backyard gatherings, the occasional bark of a restless dog. But inside him, a different kind of silence grew, one that thudded heavy in his chest, louder than any parade or small-town chatter could ever be. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes, letting the memories come. It wasn't the first time he had seen a child overlooked. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed a community decide, quietly and collectively, to forget a pain that didn't directly touch them. Shaq's earliest memories were stitched together with moments like that. Small, sharp, and unforgettable. He remembered being 10 years old, standing outside a soda shop in Baton Rouge, clutching a crumpled dollar bill in his sweaty palm, while the man behind the counter pretended not to see him. He remembered the way his mother, Lucille, had stood tall behind him, her hand firm on his shoulder, her voice even as she told him they didn't need ice cream that badly anyway. He remembered the looks too. The way white mothers pulled their children closer when he walked by. The way teachers hesitated just a moment too long before calling on him in class. None of it had drawn headlines. None of it had been shouted in the streets. It had been quieter than that, more patient, like water wearing down stone. The weight of those moments had shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until he was much older. It wasn't the big explosive acts of hate that carved themselves deepest into your bones. It was the small ones, the daily ones, the ones no one else seemed to notice but you carried anyway, hidden under your skin like bruises that never quite faded. Shaq opened his eyes and stared at the empty street ahead of him, his mind's eye overlaying old memories onto the town he loved. He thought of the parks he played in as a kid, where certain families never let their children join his pickup games. He thought of the school awards he had won, only to hear whispered doubts about whether he'd earned them fairly. He thought of the churches where the pews were open to everyone, but the invitations to Sunday lunches were not. And yet, despite it all, he had stayed. He had built his life here, poured his heart and his money into this community, because he believed it could be better, because he had seen flashes of kindness, glimpses of hope, enough to convince him that the story wasn't finished yet. But today had rattled something loose in him. Janelle's small, proud face, the way Clarabel's hand had pulled back, the way the town had smiled and turned away. It wasn't just one act of cruelty. It was a crack running through the heart of Willow Creek, a crack that had been there long before he returned home, wide enough now that even a child could fall through it. Shaq's fists curled slowly against his thighs, his nails biting into his palms, not in anger, not in rage, but in grief. He had spent years believing that if he loved his town enough, gave enough, forgave enough, that things would change, that people would see him, really see him, and through him, others like him. He had believed that loyalty would be enough to erase history. He was wrong. Love wasn't passive. It wasn't quiet. Love wasn't turning the other cheek until your face bruised purple, and your soul shrank small enough to fit into someone else's comfort zone. Love demanded more. Love fought back. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with actions so loud, so undeniable, that the very walls built to silence it cracked and crumbled. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and wood smoke. Shaq inhaled deeply, steadying himself, feeling the slow burn of resolve settle deep in his gut. His size had always been his most obvious attribute, but it wasn't his greatest strength. His strength was in knowing when to stand still, and when to move, when to bear the weight of silence, and when to break it. Tomorrow he would break it. He wouldn't do it by shaming Clarabel Dawson. She thrived on attention, even bad attention. No, he would do it by lifting Janelle higher than Clarabel could ever tear her down. By making her and every child like her the centerpiece of a day that had tried to push her to the margins. He would create a moment so beautiful, so unforgettable, that Willow Creek would have no choice but to face itself in the mirror. Shaq rose slowly to his feet, his shadow stretching long and wide across the empty street. He felt the ache in his bones, the tiredness of a man who had fought quiet battles his whole life. But he also felt something stronger, a current of certainty, of power, the kind that didn't come from strength alone, but from standing in truth when the world begged you to sit down. He didn't know exactly how he would pull it off yet, only that he would. Tomorrow was Founders' Day auction, the biggest event after the parade, the perfect stage, the perfect moment. A plan was already sparking in the back of his mind, ideas threading themselves into a tapestry of purpose. Shaq took one last look at the square bathed in twilight, then turned toward his truck. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, steady and sure. Willow Creek might prefer whispers behind smiles, might prefer comfort over justice. But Big Shaq had outgrown the weight of silence, and tomorrow the town would hear him, whether it was ready to listen or not. The next morning, Willow Creek woke to a bright, cloudless sky, the kind that usually promised an easy day. But for Shaq, the sunlight only sharpened the edges of what needed to be done. As the town buzzed with preparations for the Founders' Day charity auction, a highlight second only to the parade itself, Shaq sat quietly at the old oak table in his kitchen, a blank sheet of paper and a black pen in front of him. The plan was simple in theory, but it required precision. No anger, no confrontation, just a mirror held so clearly, so devastatingly, that the town could not help but see itself. He thought back to every conversation he had overheard yesterday, every averted gaze, every cowardly whisper behind fake smiles. The silence had screamed louder than any slur ever could. But today, silence would not be an option. Today, Willow Creek would have to answer to itself. He wrote carefully, each word deliberate. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. His heart was steady, his mind clear. If there was a time for doubts, it had passed with yesterday's sun. Today was for action. The charity auction was held every year inside the town's community hall, a barn-like building that smelled of varnished wood and decades of pancake breakfasts. The hall was already bustling when Shaq arrived. Rows of tables groaned under the weight of baked goods, handmade quilts, donated goods, and promises of services like lawn care and babysitting. At the front of the hall stood the prized items, things people had donated for the big-ticket bidding. Clarabel Dawson, of course, had already arrived, perched behind a table covered in delicate porcelain dolls she had generously donated, their glassy eyes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Shaq scanned the crowd. The usual players were all there. Mayor Ruth Simmons, wearing a pastel suit and a brittle smile, the town's wealthier families, ready to outbid one another in a show of public generosity, and of course the working-class families, milling near the back, clutching silent hopes of maybe winning something useful. Janelle and her mother were there too, standing near the cookie table, doing their best to look like they belonged. The auctioneer, a rotund man named Calvin Briggs, climbed onto the small makeshift stage and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 88th annual Willow Creek Founders' Day charity auction," he boomed. "We're raising money this year for the Children's Playground Restoration Fund. Let's make it a record, folks." Polite applause rippled through the hall. As bidding began, Shaq waited. His time would come, but not yet. First, he needed the room to settle into its usual rhythm. The competitive bids for homemade pies, the chuckles over prank items, the loud applause when someone overpaid for a fishing trip. It was all familiar, predictable, safe, exactly what Willow Creek loved, and exactly what Shaq intended to shatter. When the bidding reached the last round, the highlight auction items, Shaq quietly stepped toward the front. He exchanged a few polite nods, but said nothing, his presence alone enough to draw curious glances. He wasn't usually one to make a show of himself. Today that would change. Calvin tapped the microphone again. "Now before we move on to the grand finale items," he said, "we have a special late edition, a very generous contribution from our own Mr. Shaquille O'Neal." The crowd murmured with excitement. Shaq rarely participated in the auction beyond donations. He preferred working behind the scenes, writing anonymous checks to cover shortfalls, never seeking attention. But today, attention was exactly what he needed. Shaq stepped forward, unfolding the piece of paper from his jacket. He handed it to Calvin, who read it quickly, his eyes widening. Clearing his throat, Calvin said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Big Shaq has offered an extraordinary prize. The winning bidder will receive, and I quote, a brand new, fully accessible, custom-designed playground for Willow Creek, gifted in the name of any child of the bidder's choosing. A collective gasp swept through the hall. A custom playground? Worth tens of thousands of dollars? It was unheard of. Clarabel Dawson stiffened visibly in her seat, her mouth tightening into a hard line. Calvin, sensing the magnitude of the moment, continued. The winning bidder not only sponsors the playground, but chooses the dedication, the plaque that will bear the child's name for generations to come. The hall exploded into conversation. Bidders leaned into one another, whispering fiercely. This wasn't just a donation. This was legacy. Status. Immortality in Willow Creek's story. Shaq kept his face calm, almost bored, but inside he was electric. The bait was set. Now he waited for them to bite. The bidding started, and it was furious. $5,000. $115,000. Higher and higher. Clarabel's son, Warren Dawson, raised the stakes quickly, clearly eager to plaster his family's name on the town's newest monument. A few of the town's other well-off citizens jumped in too, sensing an opportunity they couldn't afford to let slip away. Shaq watched it all unfold with a detached patience. He wasn't bidding. He wasn't moving. He was simply a stone in the river, letting the current swirl around him. At $30,000, the room was breathless. Calvin called for final offers. Warren, puffed with the certainty of victory, raised his hand one last time. $35,000, he boomed. The crowd erupted in applause, and Warren leaned back in his chair, triumphant. Calvin grinned and hammered the gavel. Sold. To Warren Dawson. Clarabel beamed, finally allowing herself to smile. A thin, smug thing that barely disguised the hunger underneath. Warren strode toward the stage to claim his victory, and Shaq stepped forward casually, intercepting him halfway. If you don't mind, Shaq said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. I'd like to hear the dedication name now. Warren blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at his mother, who nodded imperceptibly. Clearing his throat, Warren said, in honor of the Dawson family legacy. Polite applause followed, a few heads nodding in forced approval. Shaq smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. Actually, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, there's a small detail you missed. It wasn't the bidder who would choose the name. It was the recipient of the gift. Warren frowned. Recipient? Shaq turned to the crowd, sweeping them all up in his gaze. That playground is being dedicated to Janelle Harris. And the plaque will read, in celebration of every child who was ever made to feel invisible, we see you now. The silence that fell was deafening. Clarabel's face drained of color. The mayor stammered something no one could hear. Tasha gasped and clutched Janelle to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. And Big Shaq just stood there, steady and sure, letting the truth settle over Willow Creek like a dawn they could no longer outrun. The air inside the community hall had shifted, thick with a tension that no one could easily explain. Whispers twisted through the crowd like invisible snakes, slipping through the cracks of polite conversation. Big Shaq remained standing at the center of it all, a mountain of calm in a sea of nervous energy. Across the hall, Tasha Harris hugged Janelle tightly, her eyes wide and shimmering, a mother overwhelmed by the weight of a moment too big to process all at once. The auctioneer, Calvin Briggs, struggled for words, stammering into the microphone about moving along to the next item. But the crowd wasn't listening. Their attention clung to Shaq, magnetized by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Clarabel Dawson sat rigid in her chair, her carefully painted smile cracking under the pressure. Around her, the polite veneer of Willow Creek began to tremble. Shaq didn't move right away. He gave them time. Time to sit with their discomfort, to stew in the uneasy realization that the foundations they had built their town upon weren't as unshakable as they liked to believe. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. This was about reflection, not revenge. He waited until even the restless shuffling died down, until even the children fell into a hush of curiosity and awe. Then, slowly, he stepped forward again, toward the stage where the auction items were displayed. His footsteps echoed in the hall like drumbeats, each one deliberate, each one gathering power. Standing beside the long wooden table, he pointed to the final item, an antique grandfather clock, nearly 7 feet tall, with intricate woodwork and an inlaid gold face. It was the most expensive item up for auction, valued at more than anything else in the room, a prize that was expected to bring in a small fortune for the town's fundraising goal. Shaq raised his hand and spoke, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence. I'll buy it, he said. The clock, full price. There was a collective intake of breath. No one even attempted to outbid him. Calvin, still looking pale and uncertain, nodded hastily, sealing the sale with a dry tap of his gavel. Sold, to Mr. O'Neill. Shaq smiled politely and reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded slip of paper. He held it between two fingers, high enough for everyone to see. "And I'd like to dedicate it," he said. "Not to myself, not to my family name. I'd like to dedicate it to Janelle Harris." A murmur raced through the hall, sharper this time, edged with something dangerous and undeniable. Clarabel visibly flinched. A few people clapped, awkwardly at first, but then stronger, more confidently, as if shaking off invisible chains. Shaq turned to the microphone that Calvin had abandoned and took it in his massive hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire town was leaning toward him now, hanging on every word. "This clock," he began, "is meant to stand in the center of Willow Creek's new playground. And every time it chimes, I want it to remind this town of what time it really is." He paused, letting the words land, watching the faces before him shift. Confusion, guilt, realization. "It's time to remember that every child matters," Shaq continued, his voice growing heavier with emotion. "That the future isn't built on tradition alone, but on the courage to do better than the ones who came before us. It's time we stop pretending that kindness is the absence of cruelty. It's time we stop looking away when wrong is done right in front of us." Murmurs of agreement bubbled up now, louder, less fearful. Shaq's gaze found Janelle in the crowd. She was holding her mother's hand, her small face tilted upward, shining with something more powerful than gratitude. Pride. Hope. "This clock," Shaq said, his voice thickening slightly, "will stand as a promise that no child in Willow Creek will be invisible again. That no one will ever be made to feel less because of the color of their skin. That we see them, we hear them, we honor them." There was no applause yet, just silence. Thick, heavy, sacred. Shaq placed the slip of paper on the table beside the clock, stepping back from the microphone. He didn't need to say more. The truth had been spoken. Whether the town liked it or not, it hung in the air now. Undeniable, unignorable. Mayor Ruth Simmons finally moved, stepping toward Shaq with a look that wavered between admiration and shame. She took the microphone with trembling fingers. "On behalf of Willow Creek," she said, her voice cracking, "thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Thank you for reminding us who we are supposed to be." There was real applause then, not the polite, performative kind that had followed the parade, but something deeper, more fractured and honest. People rose to their feet slowly, some clapping with hesitation, others with tears in their eyes. It wasn't unanimous. Clarabel Dawson remained seated, her hands locked together, her mouth a thin line. Some others hesitated, uncertain whether to join, but the tide was turning, unmistakably. Shaq didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once, then stepped off the stage and disappeared into the crowd. He had done what he came to do. The seeds were planted. Whether Willow Creek watered them or let them wither would be their choice. Outside, the sun had begun to dip, throwing long shadows across the parking lot. Shaq leaned against his truck, watching families spill out of the hall, some laughing, some solemn, some looking at him with new eyes. Janelle and Tasha found him quickly. Tasha's cheeks were wet with tears. She didn't bother hiding. Janelle, shy but fierce, walked up and pressed something small and sticky into Shaq's massive palm. It was a candy wrapper, the same one she had twisted nervously in her hands the day before. "For luck," she whispered. Shaq crouched down, bringing himself to her level, the world narrowing until it was just the two of them. "You don't need luck, little one," he said, smiling through the lump in his throat. "You're already magic." Tasha pulled her daughter close again, murmuring her thanks over and over. Shaq simply tipped an imaginary hat and watched them walk away, hand in hand into a town that had just begun the painful, beautiful process of becoming something better. As he climbed into his truck, the old clock inside the hall began to chime for the first time, its deep, resonant bells rolling out across Willow Creek like a promise that could not be broken. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq allowed himself to believe it. The night after the auction, Willow Creek was not the same town it had been that morning. Conversations that once tiptoed around discomfort now buzzed openly through kitchens, over picket fences, and across small, tight-knit gatherings. Shaq's act of public defiance had cad something deep in the town's polished surface, and like a long-buried fault line finally shifting, old truths began to rumble to the surface. In the warmth of a crowded diner, Two old-timers debated in hushed tones over coffee, unaware that others around them listened more carefully than they ever had before. At the church's evening potluck, stories that had long been passed down in private whispered tones now edged into the open. Stories about the past, about things Clarabel Dawson had done, things Willow Creek had willfully chosen to forget. It started with Mrs. Eunice Harper, a retired schoolteacher whose memory was sharp despite her age. Sitting near the back of the town library's Thursday book club, she spoke without malice, but her words dropped like stones into the room's silence. "You all remember the Harris farm, don't you? Where the strip mall is now." Murmurs of recognition stirred. Everyone knew the Harris farm had once stretched wide and green, where now concrete and neon signs shouted for attention. Clarabel's daddy wanted that land bad. Eunice continued, her voice low but steady. Offered them a pittance. Said it wasn't worth much anyhow. When Henry Harris said no, well, strange how building inspectors showed up the next week, citing violations that had never existed before. How taxes doubled the year after. How threats started coming in the night. And how, one by one, those families lost everything. The room shifted uneasily. People looked down at their coffee cups, at their folded hands, anywhere but at each other. And who bought that land when the bank repossessed it? Eunice asked, though everyone already knew the answer. The Dawsons, Clarabel's family. It wasn't just the Harris family either. Whispers picked up momentum across town like a gathering storm. Stories of black families pushed off their land, of young boys denied scholarships, of small businesses shuttered under the pressure of regulations that curiously never seemed to apply to the Dawsons' friends. It all trickled out, thread by thread, a tapestry of quiet cruelty that the town had woven into its own history and covered with flags and parades. Shaq heard the first waves of it the next morning, as he visited the local diner for his usual coffee. Heads turned when he walked in, and conversations stilled, but it wasn't the cold silence of rejection he felt. It was the tense, buzzing silence of people grappling with guilt, embarrassment, and something heavier, shame. Maggie, the waitress who had served him since he was a teenager, slid his coffee across the counter with trembling hands. "Shaq," she said quietly, her voice rough. "I didn't know, I swear to you. I didn't know all that." Shaq didn't need to ask what she meant. The truth was out now. Willow Creek could no longer pretend innocence. "It's not about what you knew," he said, sipping the bitter coffee slowly. "It's about what you're willing to see now." Word traveled fast in small towns, faster when fueled by years of buried injustice. By midday, the mayor had called an emergency town council meeting. Not out of anger at Clarabel, but out of fear. Fear of what staying silent now would cost them. Fear of how history would judge them if they didn't act. There were cameras in town now, journalists sniffing out the scent of scandal. Willow Creek was on the brink, and everyone could feel it. Outside the courthouse, Shaq stood under the broad canopy of an old oak tree, arms folded, watching the town he loved wrestle with the ghosts it had locked away for too long. He didn't want revenge. That wasn't what this was about. It was about acknowledgement, about pulling the truth into the light, where it could no longer be twisted or denied. Clarabel arrived at the meeting late. Her posture rigid, her pearl necklace gleaming like armor. Her smile was gone, replaced with a brittle, defensive expression. As she walked past Shaq, their eyes met. For the first time, Shaq didn't see disdain in her gaze. He saw fear, and something sadder, exposure. She had ruled Willow Creek for so long through charm and intimidation, through whispered alliances, and polite cruelty masked as tradition. But the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she knew it. The town hall was packed to the rafters. Residents pressed shoulder to shoulder, murmuring and restless. Mayor Simmons cleared her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "We are here today," she began, "because truths long buried have found their voice." There was a pause, a painful, stretching silence, as the weight of her words settled over the room. "In the coming days," she continued, "an independent committee will investigate the land deals made in the past. We will review historical records, tax changes, and legal proceedings. And where wrongdoing is found, reparations will be discussed. We cannot erase the past, but we must choose to acknowledge it." Clarabel rose slowly from her seat near the front. Her voice, when it came, was thin, but laced with venom. "This is absurd," she hissed. "My family built this town. Our traditions are what kept it strong." "No," Shaq said, his voice steady and carrying over the murmurs. "Your traditions kept it silent." The room erupted. not into chaos but into a low, rumbling agreement. A collective release of breath that had been held too long. Clarabel staggered back into her seat, her face pale, the fight draining from her in slow, reluctant waves. She had spent a lifetime weaving herself into the very fabric of Willow Creek. Now that fabric was unraveling. Thread by thread. Shaq didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood firm, a living monument to resilience. A reminder that the foundations of a community were not laid in whispered alliances, or silent cruelty, but in truth, and in the courage to finally face it. As the meeting adjourned, and the townsfolk spilled into the warm evening, a different kind of energy buzzed in the air. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was the fragile, uncertain electricity of change, flickering and tentative, but alive. Shaq watched them go, his heart heavy but hopeful. The town was breaking apart in ways it needed to, and in the ruins, something better could finally begin to grow. Change in Willow Creek didn't come like a thunderclap or a tidal wave. It wasn't swift or dramatic. It came slowly, in the quiet moments between glances, in the tentative nods across crowded streets, in the way old patterns hesitated before asserting themselves again. But it came, and it began with Big Jack's unwavering stand in the middle of the town's oldest, proudest traditions. In the days following the town hall meeting, there was a shift, fragile but unmistakable. Conversations that would have once died in uncomfortable silence were now given hesitant breath. Long-standing assumptions, once treated as gospel, were questioned in low, wondering voices. The people of Willow Creek were waking up, and although their steps were unsteady, they were steps nonetheless. The first visible sign came from Mayor Ruth Simmons herself. In a rare display of true leadership, she announced the formation of a historical truth and reconciliation committee, staffed not by the usual faces of power, but by a cross-section of the town, young and old, black and white, farmers, teachers, and factory workers. Shaq was asked to chair it, but he declined. Change, he believed, needed to be owned by the people, not carried on the shoulders of a single man. Instead, he served as a quiet advisor, sitting in on meetings when invited, speaking only when necessary, always steering the conversation back to the heart of the matter. Acknowledgement, restoration, and healing. He didn't need a title to lead. His presence was enough. The second sign came at the First Willow Creek Baptist Church. On a Sunday morning bathed in warm light, Pastor Edwards, a man who had always skirted carefully around controversial topics, stood at the pulpit and addressed the congregation in a voice shaking with both fear and conviction. He spoke of sin not just as personal failure, but as collective blindness, of repentance, not just as private prayer but as public reckoning. He named names, not with malice, but with sorrow, and when he finished there were tears in the pews and a silence so pure it felt sacred. Outside the church afterward, Shaq stood quietly beneath the old oak tree, shaking hands and sharing quiet words with people who, just days earlier, might have struggled to meet his gaze. Some apologies came wrapped in clumsy words. Others were delivered in the fierce, wordless hugs of people who had been carrying shame without knowing its name. Shaq accepted them all with grace, not because it erased the past, but because forgiveness was a bridge, and every step across it mattered. Still, not everyone changed. Some clung tighter to the old ways, their bitterness sharpening in the face of progress. Clarabel Dawson became a ghost in her own town, her once commanding presence shrinking under the weight of truth she could no longer outrun. She sold her estate quietly, moving to a neighboring town where no one knew her name. Her departure was neither celebrated nor mourned. It was simply another crack in the crumbling facade of what Willow Creek used to be. Meanwhile, the playground project, once a simple fundraising effort, took on a new life. Designs were drawn up with community input, ensuring it would be a space where every child felt welcome and valued. Volunteers signed up in droves to help build it. Teachers hammering alongside teenagers, grandmothers painting jungle gyms with steady hands. When the groundbreaking ceremony came, it wasn't the mayor or a wealthy donor who cut the ribbon. It was Janelle Harris wearing a yellow dress and a smile that made even the hardest hearts soften. Shaq watched from the back, his hands tucked into his pockets, a quiet giant among the crowd. He didn't need to stand at the front. His pride was not in the applause or the ceremony. It was in the shift he could feel under his feet, in the way the town looked at itself and found, maybe for the first time, something worth building from. Late one evening, long after the crowds had gone, Shaq found himself walking the newly built playground. The swings creaked softly in the breeze, the fresh paint on the slides still gleaming under the moonlight. At the center of it all stood the clock, tall, steadfast, its golden hands catching the faintest glimmer of starlight. He approached it slowly, running his hand over the polished plaque at its base. In celebration of every child who was ever made to feel invisible, we see you now. The words were simple. But standing there, alone in the quiet hum of the sleeping town, they carried the weight of generations. They spoke of battles fought in silence, of dignity reclaimed one act of courage at a time. Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel. Shaq turned to see Mayor Simmons approaching, her arms folded against the chill of the night. "You did this," she said softly, gesturing at the playground, the clock, the town that had begun to stitch itself back together with golden thread. "You started it." Shaq shook his head, his voice low. "No. They did it. I just reminded them they could." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars drift lazily across the sky. Willow Creek would never be perfect. It would stumble. It would backslide. But it would never again be able to claim ignorance as an excuse. The mirror had been held up, and the reflection would never be unseen. When he finally left the playground that night, Shaq felt lighter than he had in years. The weight he had carried, the weight of silence, of complicity, of history, had not disappeared. It never would, but it had been shared now, by a town learning, finally to shoulder its part. And somewhere deep in his heart, Big Shaq knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The sun rose over Willow Creek, golden and gentle, casting long beams across the newly minted playground, like a benediction. The air was cool but carried the promise of warmth, and the scent of fresh wood chips and blooming jasmine hung softly over the park. Shaq leaned against the fence, his massive arms folded loosely across his chest, watching the scene unfold before him like a painting brought to life. Children flooded the playground, their laughter ringing out, sharp and sweet, against the morning sky. They were of every shade: caramel, ivory, chocolate, honey, their differences blending not into something homogeneous, but into something vibrant and beautiful, like a living mural. No one hesitated. No one stood apart. They climbed, raced, shouted, and tumbled together with the ease that only children, unburdened by the old scars of the world, could manage. Shaq's gaze followed Janelle as she sprinted toward the swings, her yellow dress fluttering like a banner. She laughed as she launched herself into the air, legs pumping, her voice lifting higher with each swing. Tasha sat on a nearby bench, a book forgotten in her lap, her eyes locked on her daughter with a quiet wonder that mirrored the transformation of the town itself. The clock tower chimed, deep and resonant, marking the hour with a sound that rolled across the playground like a call to hope. Shaq smiled, his heart swelling with something deeper than pride, something like peace. It hadn't been easy. It wouldn't stay easy, but here, in this moment, Willow Creek was becoming the town he had always believed it could be. Behind him, familiar voices stirred as townspeople gathered at the park's edge. Mayor Simmons stood with the new committee members, all of them casual today, in jeans and sun hats, their formalities stripped away in favor of authenticity. Calvin Briggs waved from the refreshment table, where lemonade and cookies disappeared almost as quickly as they were laid out. Even some of those who had resisted change, Mr. Parsons from the hardware store, Mrs. Holloway from the flower shop, were here, standing awkwardly but present, trying in their own way to be part of the new story. Clarabel Dawson was notably absent. Her departure had been quiet but unmistakable, leaving behind a vacuum that the town had quickly, almost hungrily, filled with new energy, new values. No one said her name anymore, not out of disrespect, but because the town had chosen to focus on what lay ahead, rather than what it had lost. Shaq shifted his weight, feeling the soft hum of the ground beneath his boots. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He hadn't even set out to lead. All he had wanted was to right a wrong, to make sure that no child ever felt the way he had once felt. Small, unseen. And yet here he stood, in a town remade. The playground equipment gleamed in the sun, vibrant reds, blues, and yellows. There were wide ramps for wheelchairs, low monkey bars for little hands, a splash pad where water arced and glittered like falling stars. It was a place designed for everyone, a testament written not in stone, but in laughter and belonging. As Shaq watched, a small boy, no more than 6, stumbled near the swings, scraping his knee. Before the boy could cry out, 2 older kids, a white boy and a black girl, ran to him. They lifted him carefully, brushing the dust from his jeans, checking his scrape, and helping him to the bench where a mother offered a Band-Aid with a smile. No hesitation, no division, just instinctive, simple kindness. That, Shaq thought, was the real victory. It wasn't in speeches or committee meetings, or even the grand ceremony they had planned for later, that afternoon. It was here, in the effortless compassion of children who had been given permission to see each other not as threats or burdens, but as friends, as equal. A shadow fell across him, and he turned to find Mayor Simmons standing nearby, her face open and unguarded. "You heading out?" she asked, her voice quiet. Shaq nodded, pushing off the fence. "My work's done here." She smiled sadly, understanding more than she said. "You'll always have a home here, Shaq." He tipped his head in gratitude, the gesture as heavy with emotion as any embrace. "I know." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the playground pulse with life. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "one day they'll tell stories about this. About you." Shaq chuckled softly. "Maybe. But I hope the stories they tell aren't about me. I hope they're about the kids. About how they grew up never questioning whether they belonged." With a final wave, he turned and headed toward his truck. His steps were slow, unhurried. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't leaving in defeat. He was moving forward, trusting the town to carry its own weight now, to nurture the seeds he had helped plant. As he drove away, the sound of the clock tower chiming once more drifted on the breeze, mingling with the chorus of children's laughter. He let it wash over him, let it fill the truck's cabin with something sacred and enduring. Willow Creek wasn't perfect. It would stumble again. It would forget lessons and relearn them, just like any place shaped by human hands and hearts. But it would never be the same town it had been before. Big Shaq decided that silence was no longer an option. And somewhere deep inside him, past the battles fought and the wounds carried, Shaq felt a steady, quiet certainty take root. Change had come. Real, lasting, undeniable change. And it had started not with anger, not with violence, but with a single unshakable stand. As the town grew smaller in his rearview mirror, Shaq smiled, wide, genuine, and free. It was, finally, a new day in Willow Creek. And it was only just the beginning. What would you do if one small stand could change an entire town? The story isn't over. It's just waiting for people brave enough to keep writing it. Share your heart, your hope, your truth. Because sometimes the smallest voices leave the loudest echoes.